section. I want to try to provide an understanding of how this Genesis account will conclude the life of Abraham and will move forward into those next generations. And so my hope in doing so is that we will continue to see God's faithfulness reflected here, and we'll see how God is perfectly working in and through the lives of these people here to accomplish His perfect plans. And my hope is that we too can grow to trust God in greater ways as we see God's faithfulness and providence reflected in these pages here. And so with that in mind, let's continue on now to the first family update within this conclusion to Abraham's account. And at the tail end of chapter 22, and again, if you remember from last week, this is right on the tail end of the sacrifice of Isaac, we find a short genealogy from Abraham's extended family. And really more specifically, here in verses 20 through 24 of chapter 22, the text is going to describe and reference the 12 sons of Nahor, Abraham's brother. And so just look at only verse 20 to see the opening of this description so you can see what's happening here. It says there in Genesis 22, verse 20, it says, "Now it came about after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor." And so what we see here is that sometime after the events surrounding the potential near sacrifice of Isaac, someone has shared with Abraham the specifics of his brother's family. And then verses 21 through 24 will go on from there to explain the details of his family. Now, you probably won't recall because it's been some time since we first met Nahor, but back in Genesis 11, along with Haran, who is Lot's father, Nahor is mentioned as one of Abraham's two brothers from their father Terah. And in Genesis 11:29, it was explained there that Nahor married Haran's daughter, Milcah. That's the same wife that's mentioned here in this verse. But then after that, we don't hear anything else about him until now. And so for all we know, what Abraham is hearing about here in Genesis 22, well, this is the first update, at least as far as we know, that he's heard about his brother's family. And this is the first time that he's been made aware of this large family that his brother has been blessed with. But as we read about this family here, at least at this point in the flow of Genesis, you might be thinking, or at least I was, why in the world is Abraham's brother's family being described here at this point? What does this have to do with the sacrifice of Isaac that we just looked at in chapter 22? And what does this have to do with the upcoming death and burial of Sarah that we'll see immediately after this in chapter 23? Well, to answer those questions, I think the best way to describe the placement of this short genealogy here is that this is now providing a setup for what will come later on. Really, this is a type of foreshadowing of the events that will unfold later, particularly by explaining the birth of Rebekah, who is Isaac's future wife. You see, if you look at the beginning of verse 23 here, the text tells us that Bethuel, and that's one of Nahor's 12 sons and Abraham's nephew, it says that Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. And so by explaining the birth of Nahor's granddaughter and Isaac's future wife, the narration is hinting at what will come later on. And by Abraham finding out about Nahor's family here, well, this is going to be a key factor in him knowing that where to send his servant to find Isaac a wife in chapter 24. And so as Abraham finds out that Nahor has such a large family, he now knows that there is a potential wife for his son from his extended family in the land that he came from. And this will be a wife that would comfort Isaac and a wife that would actually take on the role of matriarch in the covenant family of promise after Sarah passes away in the next chapter. And so it will be Rebekah who gives birth to the next link in the chain of the many descendants that God has promised. And so that's really kind of the connection of how this all fits together. And so as we read this, what initially seems like a random, out-of-place genealogy, well, this is actually brilliant narration within the book of Genesis. And we're not only getting an update of Abraham's family, but also we see a glimpse of where Isaac's future wife will come from. And so this is all part of the Genesis account now at this point, shifting from Abraham and to Isaac, as the history of the patriarchs will continue on after the first patriarch. But before we see the details of Isaac's life, well, the closing of the book of Abraham's life must first continue on here. And so with the next update that's found in chapter 23, what we'll read about here next is the death and burial of Abraham's wife, Sarah. And similar to the prior verses, chapter 23 is not just about the death of Sarah, but there's really a greater importance in this update as well. But to see that first, let's start here by reading the first 4 verses here in Genesis 23. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight." And so again, this chapter opens up with the death of Sarah at 127 years old. And just to give you a little framework on the timeline here, this would have been 37 years after the birth of her son Isaac, and a full 62 years after she and her husband obeyed God's initial call to leave their family and their homeland. And with her passing here, as we see, Abraham is now left in the land of Canaan to mourn and to weep for his lost wife, as he's now without his companion that's been alongside him so many years. But as the text transitions there in verse 3, we realize pretty quickly that there's more going on in this chapter than just a report on Sarah's death. Because when Abraham goes there to the sons of Heth, he explains to them that he would like to acquire a burial site to bury Sarah. Now, this might initially seem like a very mundane and a very ordinary practice, again, securing a place of burial for a loved one. But what we're actually reading about here is Abraham is now seeking to obtain his first significant and his first legal possession of land within Canaan, the Promised Land. And across the rest of this chapter, Abraham will negotiate to purchase a cave as a burial site, along with the field and the trees that go with it. And by doing so, again, this will become the initial fulfillment of God's promise to provide the land of Canaan to his people as an everlasting possession. And this particular location that we'll read about here, well, throughout the rest of Genesis, this will actually become home base for this family, you might say. Because not only will Sarah be buried here in this chapter, but also later on, Abraham will, and Isaac and Rebekah, and eventually Isaac's son Jacob with one of his wives, Leah, as well. So then this description of Sarah's death, it's really just an opportunity to explain Abraham's acquisition of this land, and his family now becoming more permanently established within Canaan, just as God had committed to them. All before Abraham's death, he's securing these things. And Abraham will now go from being, as he calls himself here in verse 4, he'll go from being a stranger and a sojourner in the land, who travels about with the permission of the leaders of the land, but he's still an alien. He goes from being that to now officially and formally being a permanent resident who has full rights and full legal access to the land. And that residence, again, would begin here with his purchase of a family burial site after the death of his beloved wife, Sarah. And so with that in mind, basically the rest of chapter 3 is going to go on there to describe Abraham's negotiations. And it lists out the discussions of Abraham obtaining this land from the sons of Heth, and particularly from one man named Ephron. And there's a lot of interesting details, certainly, about the back and forth between Abraham and those men. And the sons of Heth and Ephron, they appear at points to be generous to him as they offer him certain things, but they also appear to be taking advantage of Abraham at other points as they try to upsell him into purchasing more than he bargained for and to pay a higher price than maybe he had wanted. But for the sake of time, we're not going to read through the specifics of that conversation. But one thing I do want to point out, though, is Abraham's insistence here on paying full price for the land. And we'll read this in a moment, but he mentions this first in verse 9, and then he reiterates it again later on in the portion I'll read. But this is important because any gifts or any discounts, well, those could come back to hurt Abraham later on. Because again, at this point, he's still an outsider. And so the sellers could try to claim that he took advantage of them. And they could try to take back the land from him later on. But if Abraham pays full price, which he will, then there would be no denying that he was, again, a rightful owner of land within the Promised Land. And so take a quick look, jump down to verses 12 through 16, and we'll see that referenced here during the closing of the deal here. And so this starts in chapter 23, verse 12. It says, "And Abraham bowed before the people of the land. He spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, 'If you will only please listen to me, I will give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there.' Then Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, 'My lord, listen to me, a piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between me and you? So bury your dead.' Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard." And so, again, there you see Abraham paying that full price to Ephron of, as it says there, 400 shekels of silver. And he does so before several witnesses as well, as we saw. All of this is just to ensure and affirm that the land was properly secured and it formally belonged to Abraham. But again, with that, and with the closing of the deal, Abraham is now officially a property owner in the promised land of Canaan. And the rest of chapter 23 will go on to affirm and describe the details of what Abraham purchased. Verse 17 explains that he purchased the field and cave which was in it, and all the trees which were in the field that were within all the confines of its border. And then in verse 19, it's confirmed that Abraham does in fact bury Sarah, his wife, within the cave of Machpelah. And she becomes, again, the first of several family members who will be placed to rest in this location that Abraham purchased on that day. And so, as you think about it, God has already promised this land to Abraham, and God owns all things. All things belong to God, Psalm 24:1. And once again, now what we've seen here is that God has proven trustworthy to what He promised, and He has began to fulfill His word as God's people can now legally call the promised land home after these events that we find here in chapter 23. But now that we've seen that update there along with the first update, so far we've seen the first two updates within this conclusion to Abraham's account here. And so we've seen the description of his brother's family, and we've seen the burial of his wife Sarah within the promised land. Well, we arrive now to Genesis 24, and we see here the events that lead up to his son Isaac finding a wife. And again, this is a wife with whom Isaac could carry forth the lineage of promise, and he could pass along God's covenant commitments for this family. And we'll spend a little bit more time here in this chapter because what we find here is remarkable and really stunning details in Genesis 24 that describe how this bride for Isaac was found, and it describes for us how God providentially worked out His perfect plan through those who are involved here in this account. And we see this first with Abraham setting things in motion at the beginning of the chapter. And so let's read there at the beginning of the chapter in Genesis 24, verses 1 through 9 to see how this plan is set in motion. It says, "Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. But you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came? Then Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. And so across this scene here, what we find is Abraham is now commissioning his most experienced and his most trusted servant, and he's telling him to go to his country, to go to his relatives, and to find there a wife for Isaac. And in what appears here to be a very unique practice to the patriarchs, well, Abraham even has the servants make an oath, and he has them swear by the Lord that he will be faithful to this task, and he has them prove that he'll be faithful by placing his hand under the thigh of Abraham. There's really a lot of unknowns about the meaning of that practice, but what we do know is that it clearly meant a binding and a solemn oath. And we can see that in the fact that the servant even asked what he should do if the plan doesn't work out. He doesn't want to fail at this plan and then also be guilty before the Lord for not upholding an oath as well. But you can see that Abraham responds to the servant, and he assures him that he will be free from the oath if the woman is unwilling to return. But Abraham is quite confident that God will, in fact, work things out in accordance with his revealed promises, even as he says here, by sending his angel to ensure that a wife is found for Isaac. But along with that, we also see here how Abraham gives a stark warning to the servants as well. And he tells them twice here to make sure that no matter what, the servant does not take his son Isaac back to that country. Under no circumstance is Isaac to leave the promised land to find this wife. And this is probably very much the same reason why Abraham sends the servant rather than himself going. Because now that they're established in Canaan, well, Abraham is unwilling to leave the promised land, at least not without direct permission from God. And so he sends his servant instead, and he prohibits his son from going there. But even though they won't leave Canaan, that certainly doesn't mean that it's okay for Isaac to intermarry with their new neighbors within Canaan. And Abraham is very adamant, and he's very clear when he commissions his servant here that he must also not find a wife for Isaac from the daughters of the Canaanites. Instead, Isaac's wife, again, is to come from Abraham's country and from among his relatives. Relatives, mind you, who lived thousands of miles to the north. And more specifically here, keeping in mind the flow of what we've seen so far, very likely what Abraham has in mind as he sends the servants is the family of his brother Nahor that we just learned about earlier at the end of chapter 22. And so really what you're starting to see here is some of that connection of how these two sections are unfolding together, because Abraham, because of that update that he received earlier, well, he now knows where to send the servants to look for this wife. It's all connected. Now, as for why Abraham is so insistent that Isaac's wife must come from their family and not from Canaan, well, I think it's really twofold. And first, at this point, it's important for Abraham that he protected the inheritance and the purity of his family. And it was important for him to keep the marriage within the family, so to speak. This was very common in that day, and we even see it from Abraham himself, who married his half-sister, Sarah. But then the other reason Abraham doesn't want Isaac's wife to come from Canaan is probably because Abraham knew that for his family's faith in God to remain pure and undefiled, well, they must refrain from intermarrying with the pagan idolaters who lived all around them. Now, this certainly did not mean that Abraham's extended family shared his faith by any means. In fact, per Joshua 24, verse 2, we learn that they were very likely idolaters, just the same as the Canaanites. But the fact is if a particular woman from his family was willing to come back with Abraham's servant and to worship God as part of Abraham's family, then it would show her willingness to trust God and to believe in the one true God. And so in her doing so, this would really not be too dissimilar from the book of Ruth, where she chose to go to Bethlehem with Naomi rather than return back to Moab with her ancestors. And even if you think about Abraham's life and Abraham's faith, his faith also began with him leaving behind his home and family. And so basically her leaving and her willing to leave would prove her faith. And Abraham now sends his servant off, and he fully trusts that God will indeed provide a wife for his son, and he would provide a wife who loved the Lord just as they did, and who could be used by God to fulfill his promises for this family. But after Abraham commissioned his servant, well, the passage, of course, continues on, and it provides additional details of how the events unfold from there. And again, in this picture here, we see over these next couple sections just an incredible picture of God's sovereignty and the way he's working out these events. So let's keep reading here, and let's look next to verses 10 through 14 in chapter 24. Starting in verse 10, it says, "Then the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master, and he set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. He said, 'O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today, and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please, let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master.'" And so, as we read here, the faithful and obedient servant does exactly what Abraham directed him to do. And after thousands of miles of travel, he arrives in the city where Nahor lives within Mesopotamia. And again, this is far to the north of Canaan where he departed from Abraham. But when the servant arrives, we see here how he puts this plan in motion that will allow him to determine who it is that the wife of Isaac should be. We see first how he sets up his camels outside the well, and he does so at the ideal time when most of the women would go to draw water. And then we see how he goes before the Lord in prayer, and he seeks God's loving kindness to grant success in his task. And really, he asks from God that whichever woman offers water to him to drink, and also to his camels as well, that God would then make it clear that this is the future wife of Isaac. And so basically what we read about here is the servant essentially asks God for a sign. And he proposes that this act of hospitality and sacrificial generosity on the part of the woman, well, that would reveal who the right girl is to him. But with this proposed sign, as we read about the details of it, I think it's helpful to note that a woman who would be willing to provide water to his camels in the way that's described here, well, she would be going far above and beyond what was considered normal hospitality. In fact, commentators have explained that camels can drink as much as 25 gallons of water each at one time. And given the fact that the jar that she would be using here to draw water out from the well, it was probably likely no more than a few gallons of water, and that there were multiple camels here. Well, this would have required dozens of back and forth trips from the well to water the camels, and this was probably well over an hour's worth of work just to water these camels and to complete the task. And so this is by no means an ordinary event that the servant seeks for his sign from the Lord. And again, a woman willing to do this, she would be showing immense sacrificial service in proving that she was the future wife of Isaac. And so with that in mind, let's keep reading here and let's see how God answers the servant's prayer next. And so take a look at verses 15 through 27 to see what happens next. It says, "Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and no man had had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her, and he said, 'Please, let me drink a little water from your jar.' She said, 'Drink, my lord.' And she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, 'I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking.' So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrist, weighing 10 shekels in gold, and said, 'Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house?' She said to him, 'I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor.' Again, she said to him, 'We have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in.' Then the man bowed low and worshipped the Lord. He said, 'Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers.'" And so, as we see here, just as the servant requested, well, God immediately answered his prayer. In fact, verse 15 noted that before he had even finished speaking, well, Rebekah, who is an eligible woman of both beauty and chaste, well, she showed up to the well there. And as we know, this is, of course, the same Rebekah that we heard about back in chapter 22, who is the granddaughter of Abraham's brother. But again, with this scene, we see here described how Rebekah does exactly what the servant had proposed to God as the sign that she would be the one for Isaac. And verse 21 describes how the servant basically just watched this in silence, and we can presume in amazement as well as this all unfolded here. And then after realizing that God had answered his prayer, well, he offers abundant gifts to Rebekah as a show of favor. And then we see here how he bowed low and he worshiped the Lord for the loving kindness that was shown to him on that day. And so we see here how the faithful servant is exalting God for the success in his task that Abraham had commissioned him for. And he's exalting God for providentially working it out that he has found in Rebekah this kind woman who also happened to be a relative from Abraham's country. But even though that at this point the matter is now settled in the servant's eyes, well, there was still a need to explain to Rebekah and to her family as well why he had come in the first place, and he had to now get everyone to agree that Rebekah should return with him to marry Isaac. And so that's why the servant asked her there to lodge in her family's house in verse 23. And so basically from here, in verses 28 through 49, well, that will now go on to describe the servant's visit to that home, and he'll meet Rebekah's family, and that will include her brother Laban. And that's someone that we'll get to know a lot more later on in Genesis. And the servant will then explain to her family in great detail everything that we've seen happen thus far in chapter 24. And you can even see the servant's faithfulness continue in his duty, because at one point there, as they offer him food, he actually refuses to eat until he has shared his business for why he is with that family in that house. And so again, in verses 28 and following here, he shares with them everything that has happened, all the way from Abraham's wealth that God has provided. He explains how Sarah gave birth to Isaac in her old age, and all the way to this description earlier from this chapter of how Abraham commissioned him to find Isaac a wife. And he even explains how Rebekah fulfilled the sign perfectly that he had asked from God. And so within those verses, there is quite a bit of repetition as he recounts these incredible events to her family and explains why he's there. But in that explanation, the servant makes sure, as he's talking to them, that they understand that it was God who was the one that was overseeing and working out these events. So much so, in fact, that we'll see later on that even they acknowledge God's will in their response to the servant's explanation. In fact, jump down now with me to verses 50 through 51, and we'll see here, after everything the servant explains, take a look at how Rebekah's family responds. In verse 50 it says, "Then Laban and Bethuel replied, 'The matter comes from the Lord. So we cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken.'" And so after hearing everything that the servant has explained, well, they hear all this and they're convinced, and they agree wholeheartedly that the Lord has in fact sovereignly worked this all out, and that Rebekah should return with the servants to be Isaac's wife. And then following that affirmation, again, the servant provided them valuable gifts and precious things. And we see again how he bows down in worship to God for his kindness and providing him such great success in his journey. Now, there is one point there in a brief moment where Rebekah's family initially tried to delay her departure. But after the servant's insistence on urgency, and then after Rebekah herself agrees and decides to go immediately, well, they send her off to her new home. And I want you to see this send-off. So jump down again a little bit further to verses 59 through 61. And here we see Rebekah's departure from her home described, and the family bids farewell. So in verse 59 it says, "Thus they sent her away, their sister Rebekah and her nurse, with Abraham's servant and his men. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, 'May you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them.' Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed." And so again, the servant, Rebekah, and her entourage, well, they all head off now towards Canaan. And the family sends her off with this wonderful blessing for thousands upon thousands of descendants who will know victory over their enemies. And remarkably, in their words, as you might recall, there's a strikingly similar verbiage to what God had promised Abraham on numerous occasions. And as we saw last week, specifically after God passed the test with Isaac, God said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, verse 17, he said this. Listen to how this compares with what her family just said. He says, "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies." And so, remarkably, you can hear how this blessing from Rebekah's family, it really echoes those words from God. And seemingly what we see there is this is affirming that through Isaac's union with Rebekah, those promises from God would now stay on track through their marriage. But before God's commitments for Isaac's many descendants can be a reality, Well, there's still one more matter at hand here, and there's still a marriage that needs to happen. And so across the rest of chapter 24, the account goes on to detail what happens when the servant returns to Canaan with Rebekah in tow. And so let's read that there in verses 62 through 67. It says, "Now Isaac had come from going to Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the Negev. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel. She said to the servant, 'Who is the man walking in the field to meet us?' And the servant said, 'He's my master.' Then she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." And so now we see how Rebekah finally arrives back into the promised land. And as she approaches her soon-to-be husband here for the first time, well, the narrative provides for us this very brief but still somehow charming, you could say, description of their meeting and their coming together in marriage. And so basically this is kind of like the Old Testament's version of a romantic love story, you could say, as we see here. But as Isaac is there in the field, he's meditating, he's likely in prayer, he's likely in contemplation. He's probably still mourning the death of his mother, as we see alluded to here. And at one point he looks up, and behold, a caravan of camels is headed his way. He very likely knows who's included in that caravan. But from that caravan, well, Rebekah, she looks out and she sees this lone man wandering the field. And after the servant tells her that this is her future husband, well, she veils herself, very likely in a symbol of betrothal and a symbol of her upcoming marriage to this man. And so what you could say here as we read about this picture is this is potentially love at first sight, you might say, albeit from a very long distance away. But then the chapter concludes, and we see how Isaac, well, he takes Rebekah into Sarah's tent, which would now, of course, become Rebekah's tent. And they become husband and wife at the end of this account. And so the language here, it alludes to a confirmation and a consummation of their one flesh covenant union and marriage. And the implication here in the text is that this marriage, well, it basically happened right away after they met. But while this immediate marriage, it might seem a bit rushed, it might seem a bit abrupt, the text is still very clear that even though they had just met, well, Isaac, as it says here, already loved his new wife. And so he's rejoicing over this bride, and uniting with her in the Lord is a great comfort to him, as the text says, particularly after his mother's death. And so as Rebekah joins this family, well, she basically now fills Sarah's shoes in more ways than one, because she takes on the role now of the leading woman and the future mother as the matriarch of this family. And she also takes on the role of comforter to Isaac in the process. But again, as you think about the haste in this marriage, again, marrying right after they meet, there's an important clue here that helps us understand that in better ways. Because if you look at verse 66 again, and you take notice there, it references how the servant shared with Isaac all the things that he had done. Meaning all of the things that God had providentially worked out during his time in Abraham's family's land. All the things that God had done to reveal that Rebekah was the right woman. And so for Isaac, as he's hearing this account, as he's hearing about all these things, well, he now knows immediately that God had meant for her to be his bride. And again, the fact that Rebekah was willing to leave her home, well, that had already proved that she was convinced. And so God's will for their union, well, it was quite clear to them immediately, and it made sense for them to marry right away. So we see here with this couple, there's no need for any premarital counseling of any kind, because God himself has affirmed that they were meant to be together. But really, all these events here across chapter 24, as we look to all that's been revealed here that leads up to this marriage, again, as you take a step back, this is an incredible picture of God's grace and His kindness in His providence. God had, of course, already ordained who Isaac would marry and who he would continue forth this lineage with. But now He perfectly works out that plan and really behind the scenes throughout these events here. Because Abraham sends out the servant whose test is perfectly met by Rebekah. And her family affirms her to go and marry Isaac, which she desires to do as well. And Isaac then joyfully receives and accepted God's kind favor with Rebekah as his wife. And so across it all, the participants in these events, well, they prove faithful as well, because they're trusting God to sovereignly work out as He deems best the events here. And they knew that God would direct their lives, and they knew that God would cause these events to work out for their good. And so really what we find here with this picture of trusting in God's sovereignty is a wonderful example for us as well, to know that just as we see here, He will work out in the circumstances of our lives what will accomplish His good purposes. And even when the outcome is not favorable, like what we find here, He's still working towards our good and ultimately His glory. And so this really is a marvelous account of God's sovereignty within daily circumstances, where His people can always know that He is active in and through their lives. But as we move now into chapter 25, we see also how God was still at this point working in Abraham's life as well, all the way up until the end. And with this fourth and final event across Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 18, well, we arrive now at the description of Abraham's death and burial, as well as what really reads like his last will and testament. And it explains his inheritance for each of his children. But first, there's a bit of a surprise update on Abraham's life in verse 1 here. And so just take a look very briefly at Genesis 25, verse 1. Because this chapter starts off by saying, "Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah." And so this chapter begins by revealing that Abraham took another wife named Keturah. And then verses 2 through 3 will actually go on to name 6 sons that she bore to Abraham, as well as several grandsons that were born through them. And very little is provided here or anywhere else in Scripture about Keturah or her sons. But additional family for Abraham at this point does mount a bit of a surprise for us, simply because of how old Abraham would have been at this point. After all, Abraham was 137 years old when Sarah died. And so when you combine that, along with the fact that Keturah is called a concubine elsewhere, this has led some to speculate that Keturah might have come into the picture actually before Sarah's death, very similar to the way that Hagar did. But I would say that Abraham's recent pattern of faithfulness and the fact that she's called here another wife, as in him getting married again as he was before, well, that would maybe seem to at least lean towards and give evidence that Keturah was taking Sarah's place as his new wife sometime after her death. And providentially, God had worked it out that even at this old of age, Abraham could have additional sons. But regardless of the timing of their relationship, it's helpful to note here that the point in this chapter is not to discuss that marriage. After all, Sarah was the mother of the covenant line, and thus she was his most prominent wife. But rather, the point here is to explain that Abraham did indeed have other sons besides Isaac and besides Ishmael, and that as a faithful man, he ensured that those sons were cared for as well. Take a look down at verses 5 through 6. So you can see that. It says, "Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still alive, or still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east." And so again, we're seeing here that before Abraham passed away, well, he made sure to get his affairs in order and to meet the needs of all his sons. But while Abraham was generous to care for those other children, verse 5 certainly makes it very clear here that it was Isaac who received all that Abraham had. And so Abraham at this point is passing the baton of God's covenant commitments to Isaac alone. And he's making it known that only Isaac would now be the recipient of God's unique favor that we've seen thus far. And you even see here how Abraham sends off those other sons away from Isaac to protect the inheritance and the promises meant for Isaac alone, just in the same way that he sent off Ishmael earlier on, as you might recall. But at this point, now that Abraham has put everything in order for his sons, the text will now go on to describe the death and burial of the first patriarch to the Jewish people. And so read with me now verses 7 through 11 so you can see this. Starting in verse 7, it says, "These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 125 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the sons of Zohar the Hittite, or the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field which Abraham had purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. It came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived in Beer Lahai Roi." And so at 175 years old, of course, Abraham certainly did live until a ripe old age, as it says here. And just as God had also promised earlier on in Genesis 15:15. And having now been immensely blessed by God, he dies as an old man who is satisfied with life, as it says. And then in death, he was gathered to his people, the text says, which may be describing how he was joined together with his believing relatives who had preceded him in death. And then finally, after his death, he was buried alongside his wife Sarah in the same cave that he had purchased earlier back in chapter 23. And this was a burial that, as we see here, included a bit of a surprise reunion between Ishmael and Isaac. And that alludes to it there at least being enough peace between them to bury their mutually loved father. But then we see there in verse 11 that now that Abraham has passed away, it says that God blessed his son Isaac. And there's no specifics of the blessing provided here, but so far in Genesis, a blessing has meant many children and it has meant prosperity as well. And both of those would be true for Isaac just as they were for Abraham. But of course, the greater blessing here that God is affirming would certainly allude to him now officially passing the torch from Abraham to Isaac. And Isaac would now be the head of this family of God's unique favor. And Isaac would now be the sole heir of God's covenant commitments. And Isaac would now carry forth what began with Abraham. And so Isaac is now the next link in the chain of this blessed lineage that would, of course, one day lead to the promised Redeemer. And thus the Genesis account is now going to shift its focus accordingly away from Abraham and towards Isaac and his sons who will receive the attention moving forward. But prior to that, there is one more son of Abraham that needs to be addressed here. Because as we've seen, all of Abraham's surprise other sons have already been referenced, and Isaac is clearly described here as the one who would be uniquely blessed by God. But the book must also first be closed on Ishmael. And we'll see this very quickly, but that conclusion to Ishmael's account comes in the form of a genealogy. So just take a look only at verse 12 for a moment to see the start of that. It says, there in verse 12 of chapter 25, it says, "Now these are the records of the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maid, bore to Abraham." And those next verses, well, they'll go on to list out and name Ishmael's 12 sons They're called there actually 12 princes. And that confirms that God was indeed faithful to fulfill his promises for Ishmael as well. Because he told Hagar in chapter 16, and then he told Abraham in chapter 17 that Ishmael would be the father of 12 princes, just as we see here, and that Ishmael would have many descendants, and he would become a great nation. That's all affirmed here. But then God also said earlier on that Ishmael's hand would be against everyone, and that he would settle to the east. And we see those promises affirmed here as well. So jump down to verse 18. And verse 18 describes the fulfillments of God's promise when it describes how Ishmael's people settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as one goes towards Assyria. He settled in defiance of all his relatives. And so even though Ishmael lived a long and prosperous life of 137 years old, verse 17 tells us that, the text in this description here is making it certain that he was still separate from the son of covenant promise, Isaac. There's a physical separation, just like the other sons, from the one son who has received God's blessing here. But now with that clarity that we get here, well, Ishmael has now been addressed. All the other sons of Abraham have now been addressed. And again, this fully settles all the matters of Abraham's life. And this fully clears the way and makes way for the text to focus now exclusively on Isaac and his sons. And we'll begin to see that next week, Lord willing. But again, that now brings us to the conclusion of the account of Abraham's life. And as I said up front, the details of Abraham's life across Genesis chapters 12 through Genesis 25, as we see here, well, this has been an incredible picture for us of God's kindness and God's faithfulness to this man. And God has offered abundant promises of wonderful blessings to this forefather in the faith, and God has delivered on those promises. And he has proven that he is trustworthy to his word. And having called out Abraham, again, based on nothing inherently special about him, and having blessed Abraham to become the father of all who believe, as Paul calls him, well, God has continually formed and shaped this man into a giant of faith that persevered all the way until the end. And God graciously gifted faith to Abraham, and God graciously preserved that faith all throughout the ups and downs of Abraham's life that we read about. And so as we now reflect on all that we've seen across this account of our spiritual forerunner, this should also be a reminder of God's mercy and God's grace in our own lives as well. And as the book is now closed on Abraham, I pray that we would look at God working in his life as a wonderful testimony of God's faithfulness to always do as he says in our lives as well. And it would be a testimony of God's kindness to bless us, his covenant people, abundantly beyond what we deserve. The reality is, if we're honest, Abraham's roller coaster of faithful living that we've seen in these chapters, well, it's not too dissimilar from our life. And yet, just like Abraham, God enables us to persevere until the end and to bring him glory with our lives. And so, by God's grace, let us allow these wonderful realities about God working in and through the life of Abraham. We'll let these things encourage us and let them motivate us to live a life of faith that imitates all of the best about Abraham. So with that in mind, let's pray together. Lord, we do thank you for this wonderful account of the life of Abraham and all that we've seen across these chapters of how you called out Abraham. Again, nothing inherently special about him, a pagan idolater. Just as you've called us out, Lord, those who are enslaved to our sin, those who hated you with the whole of our lives, and you graciously called us out. And as we've seen, Lord, how you've been abundantly generous with such wonderful blessings and promises for Abraham, just as you are for us, and how you've sustained and persevered and preserved Abraham's faith all the way up until the end, just as you've promised that you'll do for us as well. And even through those times of unbelief and through those moments where he was not trusting in what you've revealed as your will for his life, you were still faithful to your promises, Lord. You're still true to your word, as you always are, just as you are in our lives as well. And so this is a wonderful account, Lord, a wonderful testimony of so many of your incredible attributes that you make known through the life of Abraham. And I pray that we would reflect on these things. Again, that we'd be encouraged by these things and we'd be motivated through these things to rest confidently in your wonderful promises for us who are in Christ by your grace, Lord. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. We have time if there are any thoughts or questions. I know I skipped over